Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, the two chapters we're reading today are 1 Samuel chapter 3, which in essence is about how to hear God, and then 1 Samuel chapter 4, which is a sober warning not to mess with God. And so the scene opens in Samuel's bed area. So he was like in boarding school, growing up with Eli the prophet, and his bed was right near the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you came to visit Sue and I down here in Cape Town and you had a kid, you would chuck him into this little bunk bed, which is tucked away in our spare room. And so the action happens there. The chapter opens with this line: the word of the Lord was rare in Israel at the time. In other words, not much prophecy. Not much opportunity for Samuel to hear how to hear God. And so this verse says he didn't know God. He knew about God, didn't know God. But he was at sleep early evening, and he hears this voice, Samuel, Samuel. So he hops up and he runs to Eli and he says, yes, what is it that you want? He said, I didn't call you, go back to bed. Well, it happens 3 times. Third time, Eli realizes this is the Lord speaking. So he says to Samuel, listen, next time you hear that voice, say it's your servant and I'm ready to hear you. And so God tells him, listen, Phinehas and Hophni, these boys of Eli who are representing me, they are behaving in a debauched way and Eli is not stopping them. I'm bringing an end to this. Well, Samuel was very nervous to tell Eli, but Eli gets it out of him the following morning and says, listen, what is it that God said? Because God had said to Samuel, see, I'm going to do something in Israel that would make everyone's ears tingle. In other words, it's going to be a hectic thing that God is about to bring judgment on the house of Israel. Anyway, Eli gets it out of Samuel. And so when he hears that his sons are going to be judged, Eli says, he is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. And so what do we get out of this chapter in terms of hearing God? Well, firstly, hearing God requires positioning. Positioning in God's presence. I mean, there was Samuel in the presence of God right near the ark. You want to hear God? Get into his presence. What does that mean? Well, go to church. His presence is there. Draw aside into your prayer time, prayer moment, and say, God, I'm coming into your presence. You see, God is everywhere, but when you step toward him in faith, that's called going into his presence. In addition, you to position yourself with childlike humility, God speaks to Samuel, the boy, because he's humble. He's like, there's this innocence about him. We approach God that way, not with a suspicious, interrogatory, God, you show yourself to me. No, humbly like a child. And then it says after that, at the very end of this chapter, that Samuel became familiar with God's word. He devoted himself to God's word. And so you hear God's voice through his word. So in his presence, through his word, and with a humble posture. Let's move on to chapter 4. Now, chapter 4 is a sad story. The 2 boys, Phinehas and Hophni, are behaving really badly, and Israel goes out to war with the Philistines, and so they take these counterfeit, badly behaving priests, the Ark of the Covenant, out to battle. Well, God says, I'm not going to tolerate this. So he lets thousands of Israelites get defeated. The Ark gets captured. Phinehas and Hophni get killed. And, a man comes running back to Eli. And this is the picture. Eli sitting back. It says that he was, in the less polite translation, says he was fat, but he was overweight, 98 years old, waiting, listening, hard of hearing and sight. And he hears a great commotion in the city. And he says, what's going on? He says, well, we've lost the battle. Your sons have been killed. They've captured the ark. He must have gasped in horror and lost his balance because of his weight. Well, that's what it seems like. And as he fell over, he broke his neck. And, it's a horrible ending to a man who had led Israel for 40 years. But there's a warning here. in that you can't play with God. Phineas and Hophni were just messing around with God. And one of their wives was pregnant. And when she went into labor after hearing that her husband had died, she gave birth to a son. She dies in labor. Tragic, tragic. And the people look at the little boy and they name him Ichabod, which means the glory of the Lord has departed. I can remember one of the guys who was on staff here who had a car that was so old. He called his car Ichabod because, I mean, he generally had to push this car everywhere where he was going to get it jump-started. Tragic that God lifted his presence from someone who had been serving him because he didn't deal with his household. You can't mess with God. Anyway, God bless you.